Hello, everyone. We're super excited to be here with you today. This is our first time at Strange Loop after being longtime fans, and we're delighted to see so many faces that I'm sure I would recognize if I saw your avatar. We want to let you know that slides and speaker notes are both available at bit.ly/breaking-the-internet.
So hello, welcome to Remember When We Broke the Internet. So you may be here to listen to us tell stories about when we were personally responsible for breaking the internet, but we are not going to tell those horror stories today. So. What we are going to do is take a look at the times when open source, or something that looks very much like it, caused disruption in our technological landscape. And that's not nearly as straightforward as our postmortems and our retrospectives would have us believe, because it's all interconnected. We'll be diving into the complex socio-technical systems and to see how they intersect with open source. So you're not going to see a single line of code, I'm sorry. But what you will see might amuse you or humiliate us. We're not really sure.
It's going to be great.
So I'm Julia. I have been working in open source for most of my career. And I call myself an open source archaeologist because I dig into projects, into data, and I try to figure out what is going on in the system at a large scale. Where are the series of tiny walls, series of small walls?
Yeah. And I'm Amanda Casari. I'm fortunate that most recently my work has focused on understanding the nuances of open source, where it works, where it needs support, and where are all the things tucked away in the back room that we didn't know were holding up the internet. So now, before we jump into story time, Julia and I would like to level set with you a few foundational concepts to make sure we're all on the same page.
This is the obligatory what is open source slide. Who here uses open source? Excellent. Who here knows the definition of open source? Yeah, so there are certain criteria that open source or a project has to fulfill in order to be considered technically open source. So these were laid out in 1998 when the open source definition was created. And we're just going to spend a tiny bit of time going through it. This is the driest part of the talk, I promise. So in order to be open source, you got to have the code. It's got to be available, modifiable, and redistributable. Those are the ones that most people know. Also, though, it has to be technology neutral, and it has to respect the author's integrity and intent. Open source does not mean that you don't have intellectual property rights. Also, you are obligated to distribute the license of any open source software that you use. I am contractually obligated to say this anytime I'm on stage. There are asterisks to that that don't really apply to this talk. Finally, there are things you can't do if you're still going to be considered open source. You can't discriminate against people, groups, or areas of use. That means you cannot prevent an industry that you do not like from using your technology. It also can't restrict the use of other software, so Project A can't prevent you from using Project B, and it also can't restrict the type of project or product that you use it for. That's the dry part. And it's done.
Right, and I will say, Julie and I do use open source sometimes as a term and a concept and lots of different things, and so we wanted to make sure we were setting really here, like when you're talking about open source licensure as it applies towards our talk and history, this is the framework we will be talking about open source within.
And it will come up again.
It won't come up again, not like that. Can you step one step that way? I'm sorry, working on mics. This is the first time we've done a talk in person together, and we've worked together since 2019, so this is super exciting. Yeah, thanks for the clap. Totally appreciate it. Thanks. Yeah, helps. It's much better than talking to myself on a blank screen over any other platform, so I love that everybody's here, thank you. Okay, first we're going to have a very brief introduction into complexity theory. This is Complexity Theory 101, an entire semester in one slide. The conceptual framework of complexity theory is that this defines complex systems. So complexity theory states, I keep getting feedback. Do my best. If anybody has any suggestions, you can shout them out. Complexity theory states that while complex systems are unpredictable, they are constrained by order-generating rules. So a complex system has components that interact in multiple ways, following local rules, and there is no unifying rule that defines all interactions, as much as scientists would really like that to happen. Also in a complex system, the emergent system is greater than the sum of its parts.
Next, we have a special kind of complex system, a socio-technical one. Some of those shapes are now people. In a socio-technical system, we have two new considerations. You cannot separate out the social and technical aspects of an organization because they are linked inextricably, as much as we like to pretend otherwise sometimes. We also need to ensure that we account for the interactions between our society's complex structures and the behaviors of the people who live within them. Hi, I'm one of those people. But what does that have to do with open source?
Well, when we examine the evolution and individual layers of open source, we can see that open source has components that interact in multiple ways, following local rules. There is no unifying rule to define all interactions in open source, and that emergent system is greater than the sum of its parts. So I think we can confidently say that open source is a complex system.
And the logical conclusion here is that it is also a socio-technical system. If we want to understand open source and how it changes, we have to acknowledge that open source is fundamentally about people and technology. We cannot remove how we, as humans, interact with ourselves, each other, and the different technical components of our systems without reducing the problem to the point of meaninglessness. This is most important when disruptions happen, which fundamentally change the landscape of open source.
So if we want to talk about disruptions in ecosystems, some of these may be what are called a black swan event. And so what makes these events so special? There are three critical components that must exist for us to consider a disruption a black swan event. So black swan events ultimately disrupt the status quo, they cause systemic change, and they seem inevitable in hindsight. So today we're going to focus with you on a few specific events in the history of open source which highlight the complex socio-technical nature of our evolving ecosystem.
So, in order to explain specific black swan events, we have to look at them in their historical context. Any amateur historians here? Okay. We're going to make amateur historians of all of you. For anyone who's worked in open source, for more than like a couple weeks, you have this idea of how it used to be. Looking back farther, as we do in open source science and archaeology, we distinctly see where open source has evolved over time, as well as where evolution happens through the disruption of norms.
So speaking of disruption of norms, we've talked about this before, Julia, in a timeline, and I know you have a great project, an open source project, that looks at the timeline of open source. But I think for today, for this audience and the world at large, if we want to get everyone to understand how big of a disruption this is, I think we should try maybe something different than just a timeline. Maybe?
What do you propose?
How about a song?
Is that a cat playing a piano?
It is!
That sounds really cheesy, and I'm a cheesy person, so let's do it.
Okay, fantastic. So we're gonna sing the lyrics, sing. And if you are familiar with the chorus of this specific song that is being parodied, then we would love for you to sing along. We will provide the lyrics for the chorus. And we hope that you just do your best, maybe help us out, and we'll all get there together, just like in open source.
But we're also perfectly happy looking foolish on stage alone.
Oh,
So
oh yeah.
It'll just be awkward for everyone.
But singing loudly and audience participation is highly encouraged and appreciated. Oh, ready?
Okay.
All right. Antithera, mathematicians, Ada Lovelace, difference engines, world wars, Alan Turing, Grace Hopper, debugs, public domain, ARPANET, now we can all typeset, software copyright, like a book, not a light.
New guy comes on the scene, MIT license, Macintosh, Commodores, free software is on the run, Morris worm, licensing, GPL or BSD, Linux, Python, combat boots for everyone.
Okay, pause here. Okay, we're gonna go back, rewind, be kind. We're gonna go back to 1988. So in 1988, there were about 60,000 computers networked together to form the public internet. And so while there was an increasing number of industry networks all selling the power of connection in the workplace, a majority of these computers were government or academic systems. And the Morris worm, or the worm, because it was so famous, was created inadvertently, asterisk. This asterisk indicates a point that is a little contentious, but we all agree on to be congenial people. So it was inadvertently released by Robert Taplin Morris. And Morris was a student at Cornell, but released the worm via a system at MIT in order to prevent it being traced back to him as a part of a research project examining internet systems and how their open protocols could be exploited. This worked much quicker than Morris expected. And by exploiting multiple operating system vulnerabilities, most importantly, by exploiting the transitive trust that existed at the time between sysadmins and users, the Morris worm infected about 10% of the global internet in a matter of days. So there are many notable firsts from this event, which include being the first computer worm to be distributed via the internet, as opposed to traded on floppy disks or removable media. Morris was also the first felony conviction in the US under the 1986 Computer Fraud and Abuse Act.
I feel like we can all relate here, right?
Right, it's just a project, I swear.
Yeah.
Okay, so why does this event matter to open source, and how is it a black swan event, right? So using our magical glasses of hindsight, we can clearly see where the status quo was changed and how this influences how we operate still today. So first of all, we do not assume that everyone is operating in everyone else's best interest. This event happened in November of 1988, and that was months before GPL and Linux were released for the first time. So we cannot ignore the human interests, community expectations, and social trust that existed at the time of those releases, all of which were fundamentally impacted by the Morris worm. The reaction to and recovery from the Morris worm also demonstrated the robustness of an internet which is designed as a partitionable distributed system, which prioritized open knowledge sharing. So Morris quickly worked to move fixes to the worm onto multiple mailing lists, and sysadmins were able to work together to isolate damage and prevent impacted systems from infecting farther. So because of the Morris worm, the internet and the software which it runs on is totally changed. There's a pivot in security regulation and international laws. We didn't want all systems to look alike anymore. Before, super homogeneity was seen as an efficiency, now it's seen as a risk. And also there was a hard lean at the time, especially in industry and government, to move to proprietary systems. Now back to the song. Time for the chorus. This is the audience participation part, so everyone who knows this, please join in. We didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world's been turning. We didn't start the fire. No, we didn't light it, but we tried to fight it. JavaScript, Ruby, Murphy versus Libby. Open source gets a name. CVEs ain't cheap. ASF and LF, PSF, so many Fs. TCP dump Trojan gets released for keeps.
GNU guy drives away more women every day. Everyone's got a bug. Everyone's got a bug. Maintainership is now a slog. Dive into vaporized. Codes of conduct on the rise. Underpaid, unmaintained. Open SSL compromise.
That was a stretch, but it works. We promise. We promise. Okay.
So wait. We need to stop at 2014. This is one of my favorite examples when talking about open source as a complex socio-technical ecosystem. So Heartbleed was first released, like it was a product launch, in 2012, but it was only publicly disclosed 2 years later in 2014. So what was it? Well, it was an issue with one of the most popular open source cryptography libraries called OpenSSL. It made user-entered data vulnerable to being captured by actors, malicious and non-malicious alike. So we don't talk about the non-malicious ones, right? Right, okay. So with that data, malicious actors could impersonate users, compromising more information. It affected, because of the composition of the internet at the time, at a minimum of 66% of the internet, including government databases. They don't hold any sensitive information, right? No. Okay. So this really drew attention to the fact that while open source itself is a distributed system, maintainership isn't necessarily. Very few people at the time realized that OpenSSL in 2012 to 2014, was maintained by effectively one person. Some reports say two, but effectively one. And it was maintained on an entirely volunteer basis. The maintainer had a day job. They didn't have time to go and patch this critical piece of open source software. Insert XKCD comic here. An argument in favor of open source is that many eyes make all bugs shallow. But if somebody doesn't have time to incorporate a fix, we've got an issue. So in OpenSSL's case, the maintainer didn't have time, given their job, to mitigate Heartbleed. This resulted in companies trying to throw money at the problem and essentially paid the maintainer to take a leave from their job and fix Heartbleed. So increased interest and focus on open source sustainability. Supply chain analysis. That's something we hear sometimes every once in a while these days, right?
Just a little.
Just a little. And how to go about trying to find these dependencies that, hold up the internet. And more companies that relied on open source, all of them, found a renewed reason to invest in open source, whether that was through funding, through sponsored development, what have you, because they saw it as an investment in their own stability. It's not entirely altruistic, it's for their own good, too. So, OpenSSL, but back to the song. Chorus.
Okay, time for another chorus. So please, again, that was a great effort.
Yeah.
Let's be a little even louder, and everybody join in.
Honestly surprised, yeah.
We didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world's been turning. We didn't start the fire. No, we didn't light it, but we tried to fight it. Transitive dependencies, gnarly graphs, not clean trees. Oops. Naming things is tricky. LeftPad not in registry.
What?
Well, okay. This is getting more frequent now, isn't it?
I mean, we could see this as a measure of the success of open source, but yeah, it's kind of happening a lot more now.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay, so it's now 2016. For those of you not familiar, LeftPad is the name of a package in the NPM registry. This is the Node.js package management, which is also commonly how this event is referred to. So in 2016, there was a trademark disagreement over an NPM package name, specifically not LeftPad itself, but a different package. And when that trademark disagreement was filed with the registry, which was then and now still remains privately held, NPM sided with the trademark holder over the developer who had named their package that name. So in response, the maintainer deleted all of his NPM packages, including LeftPad. And it was this deletion, LeftPad, from the package registry that showed how deep of a transitive dependency LeftPad had become for many other packages in the NPM ecosystem. And because of the way NPM references dependencies during their build process, this caused widespread failure, including crashing many popular websites and services.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure, yeah, always.
Can you remind me, because it's not really self-evident, what did LeftPad do?
It puts spaces to the left.
Oh, okay.
It formats.
You know, like a Black Swan event, that was evident in hindsight.
I think using a package to put spaces to the left could have potentially been seen as a I think that's a good thing to examine, formatting. Okay. Transitive dependencies, though, very challenging thing. People want to reuse code. Code's supposed to be reusable. That's a tenet we have, right? This is not simple, Julia. It's complex. Okay, so in response, NPM restored a version of the unpublished package without the maintainer's consent. Okay, ooh, I hear a lot of oohs in the audience. Okay, I do have to bring up that we do have to say unpublishing code and releases was perfectly legal.
Remains perfectly legal.
Remains perfectly legal under the open source licensure terms as well as terms and conditions of the privately owned package manager. So we've heard of the phrase free to fork, which refers, that's a big F, capital F fork, by the way, not like the git command, which refers to the fact that licenses outline shareability or not, reusability or not, and attribution or not. Choose your license carefully. So this also puts a bright spotlight on the Node.js development philosophy, which at the time had a decreased awareness in dependency complexity for developers as they were choosing how to build things. So as you pointed out, at the time, it was quite popular to use other people's things and connect things together, regardless of the dependency tree that you were building. And so as a result, we yet again get a glimpse, just like before, into the increasing costs of maintainer burnout or losing one maintainer from an ecosystem, as well as kicking off a new round of discussions around maintainer rights and open source contractualism. There was also additional scrutiny placed around privately run package managers for open source software, which remains a contested discussion now, with again the current emphasis placed on securing the software supply chain. And we were on a roll before that rude interruption, so we're gonna get back to it. Deep breath, let's go back to the song. Julia, this one's yours.
What was once community, now's become a strategy. Driving towards the stock exchange, now yet another license change.
Okay, pause again. Pause again, sorry. We have to stop again.
Oh, this is me, okay. Well, now we get into some of the more controversial territory of this talk. It's time for everyone's favorite technical topic in open source, the legal side.
It's not as dry as the beginning, though, we promise.
No, this is much more, this is...
And also, we are not lawyer cats. We're not lawyers, just as our disclosure for that part, too.
I read an amazing amount of regulation, though.
I know, but we have to say it. You don't have the ears.
Okay. So, as I mentioned before, we've done an amazing job at convincing people of the value of open source.
Good job, us.
Hey, yeah, awesome. Yeah. But we might have swung the pendulum a little too far? Maybe. Because open source once was an expression of freedom, of counterculture, and a little bit of subversion, but not the source control system. And it's now a part of a business model. Companies developed open source software with the goal of monetizing it. Additionally, it was around the same time that this thing called the cloud offered companies a way to not have to be in the business of data centers. It gave them the flexibility and the ability to focus on their core product differentiation, their business, instead of optimization. These cloud service providers saw the opportunity to take this further by offering managed services, namely running open source projects for you. This effectively cut out the companies who had developed the open source technologies out of the equation and made it so that they couldn't realize on their anticipated monetization. So they explored other options, and in some cases, they switched away from open source models altogether. That was a very large oversimplification of a lot of years. I have personal opinions on this matter, which are not uncontroversial. But the long and short of it is the cloud providers were actually perfectly within their rights to do what they did. It's entirely allowed under the open source model. Were they monetizing open source? Yes. Had others done this before them? Yeah. What had shifted was our technological landscape, because we were focusing on developer productivity instead of end user products. And this had a tremendous amount of impact on open source itself. We saw and are still seeing a muddying of the open source waters. You're hearing the phrases open core or source available as companies try to keep their reputations as open source companies without actually being open source. And we have seen those public capital F forks that attempt to keep the project going as it had been prior to the license change. And in some cases, that's bifurcated the development community. and it's introduced a little bit of confusion in the overall ecosystem. There's an increasing amount of discussion around how companies can participate in the open source ecosystem and be additive to it. But sometimes even more importantly in the ecosystem's view, is how companies can participate in open source and be seen to do so, and be measured to do so. And there's this thing called capitalism. I don't know if you've heard of it. It put an increased amount of conversation about how capitalism intersects with open source or doesn't, and that is something that still has not been hashed out. And probably, I don't think any of us will see it hashed out, actually.
No one unifying rule.
Yeah. So, you know the drill.
One more time. This is the final chorus, everybody. So give it all you got. Ready? Okay. We didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world's been turning. We didn't start the fire. But when we are gone, it will still burn on and 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 on.
She's got more staying power than I do.
Woo!
Nice job.
No training. No training.
So just like the song, we could go on and on and on and on and on, mostly because we keep getting new material to add to this deck.
Yeah, we stopped at 2018. There's way more to go.
Yeah. You may have noticed some notable exceptions that may be more recent. But there are fundamental challenges which exist in the larger open source ecosystem, which are accelerating these black swan events.
Yeah, and we, I think to close out today, would like to offer you a few mitigations which could fundamentally shift us, and these are the ones we recommend as well as the ones we try to do, but shift us all towards a new future.
So part of the open source ethos is transparency. But interestingly enough, it's primarily been directed at the code. And there's so much more to open source than the code. It is a socio-technical system. The rest of how open source operates is oftentimes lost to walled gardens, private conversations, and an over-indexing on source control as the only source of truth that matters. We need to bring transparency more into open source. Bring it into the aspects of open source that are currently still in the dark. We have to explore ways that open source needs to evolve in order to reduce the frequency of these black swan events. Transparency is no longer a core tenet of open source, but it should be.
So glue work is the phrase created by Tanya Riley to describe the work that can mean the difference between a project that succeeds and one that fails. And when we talk about maintenance and sustainability, there remains a focus on certain forms of contributions. But even within the binary categorization, which I despise, of code versus non-code work, feature work and advancing new versions of a package are given more visibility than any of the engineering glue work, which enables our entire ecosystem. Glue work is not as visible as the critical, essential work of open source, but it should be.
So I'm going to talk yet again about something that no one wants to talk about. The history of open source, like most histories, is largely told from one perspective. And that hampers our ability to both reason about how events have come to pass, as well as it influences technology decisions in the future. Open source has a cult of personality problem. That is a reaction I was not expecting. Just one second while I internalize that. The cult of personality problem contributes to the problems in sustainability, reliability, and overall longevity of the open source ecosystem. We need to shine lights on these missing or untold narratives, including the glue work that makes open source possible. This may seem at odds with calling out the cult of personality problem, but they're actually just two sides to the same coin. An imbalance in celebrating these untold narratives leads to some work being undervalued, and celebrating the kind of credit-hungry, flashy work in open source. It's a sustainability, reliability, and longevity problem. Narratives are not complete, but they should be. So we didn't light this fire, but we're staying to fight it, and really hope that you do too.
Thank you.
That was like literally the most nervous I've ever been giving.
Yeah, that was terrifying.
Yeah.
Absolutely terrifying.
Thank you so much for
Entertaining.
singing along.
We did want to leave you with a list of references because we can't help but be ourselves, and we have to have references and referrals. We will hang out. It's break now. I think everybody can break. We're gonna hang out for questions. So if you'd like to talk to us or ask anything, if you have a comment that's not a question, maybe listen. But happy to sit around and talk with y'all or find you later in the conference. So thank you so much for coming.